continue to
comme
view
elle l'a
as
fait de
illegitimate,
nombreuses autres
as
occasions.
it has done on a number of other occasions.
Et la Russie menace
And the Russian
maintenant
Federation
l'Ukraine
has now turned
l'Europe
its threat to
et le monde
Ukraine,
entier
Europe, and
d'utiliser
the
des
entire
armes
world with
nucléaires
the threat of
en
nuclear
violation
weapons use
directe
in
de la
a
déclaration
flagrant
commune des
violation
dirigeants
of the joint
des 5
statement
membres
of the leaders
permanents
of the 5
du
permanent
Conseil
members of the
ce
Security
janvier.
Council this past January.
Mr. President, it was in January of this year that members of the P5 agreed that a recourse to the nuclear option, to the nuclear threat, to the nuclear possibility was wrong. They admitted that no one could win this kind of confrontation. Just a few days later, President Putin announced that he was going to resort to this threat, directly contrary to what he had promised, signed, sealed, and delivered 6 weeks before. And so here we are, with a war that is a threat to each and every one of us. Through this resolution before us today, we as members of the United Nations have the chance to stand up in defense of a free people and to rebuke the evil notion that might makes right. And now we must all step up and stand up. Canada urges all member states to unequivocally condemn Russia's actions and to vote in favor of the resolution that is now before the Assembly. Russia has not been alone in undermining these foundational norms and rules, Mr. President. Belarus has also violated its obligations under the UN Charter and under international law. By allowing Russia to use its territory to invade and launch attacks against Ukraine, Belarus is aiding and abetting Russia's illegal war of aggression. Belarus's decision to send its force into Ukraine and to revoke its non-nuclear status are all completely unacceptable to us and completely incompatible with its obligations under the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, there must be accountability for these actions. As Russia has escalated its unjustifiable attack on Ukraine, its forces have encircled and shelled Ukrainian cities, targeting, killing, and maiming innocent Ukrainian civilians, children, women, and men. They are bombing civilian objects, hospitals, schools, kindergartens, apartments, and homes. They're looting and forcibly displacing civilians. Many hundreds of thousands have fled in freezing temperatures, seeking shelter across Ukraine's borders. There are credible reports that Russian forces are using prohibited weapons, including cluster bombs, and imposing siege warfare on Ukrainian cities. This is not news that comes in last week, news that comes in this morning. Pictures one can see visibly on social media as to what is taking place. Very different from the wars that have been waged in the past. We know what is happening in real time, and it is completely abhorrent. Let me be very clear, Mr. President. These are violations of international law, and they are acts that could amount to war crimes under international humanitarian law. Those acts flow directly from decisions that were made by President Putin and his inner circle, that were enabled by Belarus and their leaders, and carried out by Russia's armed forces and its proxies. These crimes began with an idea. What was the idea? We don't have to invent it. All we have to do is read President Putin's speeches and watch his declarations. The idea that a group of people are lesser, unequal, and unworthy of worthy of the protection of the law. The idea that a people, in fact, do not exist as a people, that they don't have a right to be themselves, that they don't have a right to their own nation, to their own country, that they have no right to the protection of the Charter. The way Vladimir Putin describes the Ukrainian nation and its supporters over many generations fits the description of the idea that I have described. And it's that idea that lies at the heart of the acts that follow. Because actions don't come out of the blue, they don't come out of nothing. It all starts with an idea. And yet, with a terrible sense of irony, President Putin has perverted the very notion of genocide by alleging that genocide has been committed in Ukraine. I must stress, there has been no such finding substantiated by any UN or independent organization. And as my colleague from Brazil said, just speaking before me, if there are complaints, and obviously there have been in this chamber and in the Security Council with respect to the treatment of the Russian minority in Ukraine, even if those complaints were fully justified, they are not an excuse for war, and they are not an excuse for the aggression that we have seen. Ukraine has filed its own application under the Genocide Convention to the International Court of Justice. Canada takes the allegations filed by Ukraine with the greatest seriousness, as it does the decision of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to begin an investigation into potential crimes against humanity. These decisions are not taken lightly, and they have the most serious of consequences. But I want to stress, it is the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court that are the places for these allegations to be dealt with, not the battlefield, and never by unilateral aggression. That's why we signed up to the Charter. We signed up to the Charter because we agreed that we would subject our disputes to processes created by us over many, many arduous years and debates, what would be done in the event of a profound difference of opinion between states. We don't go to war. We go to the negotiating table. We go to court. We go to mediators. That's how we resolve disputes. The other way lies madness. Canada and the international community will spare no effort to ensure that violations of international law in Ukraine are in fact investigated, that evidence is gathered, and that the perpetrators are held to account. We do so not only out of our conviction that the use of history, that the arc of history tends towards justice. We do so because what Ukrainians are being subjected to is horrific, and they deserve better, and they deserve more. Mr. President, if I may, I'd like to speak directly to the brave people and the government of Ukraine. We are, quite simply, inspired by you. We are standing with you, and you are not alone. Our support for Ukraine, your country, for your Ukrainian democracy, and for your right to choose your own future in Ukraine remains unwavering, steadfast, and resolute. Canada will do everything in its power to help you as you hold strong and defend your homeland against this terrible Russian aggression. Together with our partners, we will ensure that President Putin and those who ordered, implemented, and enabled this reckless war will continue to face significant costs and to be held accountable for their actions. Your struggle is now our struggle, and we are with you. Mr. President, if I could speak directly to the people of Russia. To the Russian protesters who are bravely demonstrating against the war, who have been met with brutal force and arbitrary arrests by riot police. To the thousands of Russian citizens who have written letters, had the courage to put their name on a letter to the President of Russia, condemning this reckless decision. To all those Russians at home and abroad who are opposed to this senseless war, and you are in the millions. Canada and the world, we see you and we hear you. Your President, Vladimir Putin, has sorely miscalculated. He has ignored the democratic and law-abiding spirit of the Russian people. He has underestimated the brave Ukrainians defending their country from aggression, with whom you have no cause for war, no cause for hatred, no cause for violence. And he has severely misjudged the resolve of the world to stand against him. Whatever lies are spoken here today, trying to justify the unjustifiable or to explain the inexplicable, it is President Putin's war of choice that is making your lives much more difficult. But there is always time for de-escalation. There is always time for dialogue. And your president must choose this path. Should he not, I believe it will show just how much contempt he has for you and for the future of your country and the planet that we live on and share together. Mr. President, we should all say together, directly to President Putin, stop this war. Stop this war. Stop it before there is more death, more pain, and more hardship. Stop the use of threats. Take your finger away from the nuclear button and never put it back for as long as you live. Come to grips with the reality of our time, as in more serious and rational moments you have done. Mr. President, it is never too late to stop. It's never too late to make a turn to diplomacy, to dialogue, and to negotiation. The alternative cannot happen. So now it falls to all of us, as equal members of the United Nations, whose equality and sovereignty, as I've said before, is what we signed up to when we became members of this organization. We need to stand up to the principles, for the principles of the Charter, for the purposes of the Charter, and to heal the hurt and pain that has been caused by this terrible war of aggression. This responsibility belongs to us and to no others. We sit here, we have to make decisions. We have to take every step we can, the human footsteps to peace, to reconciliation, and to justice. That is now our job in the General Assembly, and we must seize this moment of accountability, this moment of justice, this moment of democracy. We must seize it together. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are meeting today in a historic emergency special session because the UN Security Council was unfortunately unable to discharge its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security as a result of the veto cast by the Russian Federation, which is regrettable. We welcome the convening of this emergency special session as it allows all countries, especially the small countries, to raise their voice, to state their views, and to register their concerns in this universal organ of the United Nations. Mr. President, Singapore has always taken a consistent position on the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. Singapore is a staunch supporter of the rules-based multilateral system and of the United Nations. The unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation is a clear and gross violation of the fundamental norms of international law and of the UN Charter. The UN Charter prohibits the use of force and acts of aggression against another sovereign state. This is a matter of principle for all small states and a matter of fundamental importance to all members of the General Assembly. For a tiny city-state like Singapore, this is an existential issue. A world order where might is right, or the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, would be profoundly inimical to the security and survival of small states. We cannot accept one country attacking another without justification, arguing that its independence was the result of, and I quote, historical errors and crazy decisions, unquote. We simply cannot accept such an argument. Such an argument and rationale would go against the internationally recognized legitimacy and territorial integrity of many countries, including Singapore. This is why Singapore condemns, in the strongest terms possible, any unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country under any pretext. We deplore the Russian Federation's special military operation against Ukraine, both its operation in the Donbas region and the broader land, air, and sea attacks across Ukraine, including on Kyiv, the capital city. We also note with great sadness and regret reports of the growing number of casualties and the loss of many innocent lives as a result of this unjustified attack and act of war. We have taken note of the UN Humanitarian and Emergency Relief Coordinator's comments about the scale of the humanitarian assistance required to help those affected, and we call for safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and all those in need. Mr. President, we reiterate that the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, must be respected within its internationally recognized borders. The Secretary General of the United Nations has stated that he considers the actions of the Russian Federation to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We agree with the Secretary General entirely. Let me repeat, we agree with the Secretary General entirely, and we support his call for the Russian Federation to withdraw all its troops from the territory of Ukraine and for the responsible actors to immediately cease all hostilities and prioritize diplomacy to address all issues peacefully in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. We also support the good offices of the UN Secretary General to be deployed in any way possible to facilitate diplomatic contacts and negotiations. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying that the world is watching us as we meet today in the General Assembly. As members of the General Assembly, we have to act swiftly, firmly, and with unity of purpose. Singapore is one of the main co-sponsors of the draft resolution that has been tabled for adoption in this General Assembly. Singapore will not hesitate to vote yes on this draft resolution. Singapore will always vote to uphold the principles of the UN Charter and to uphold international law. And I would like to urge all members of the General Assembly to vote yes for this resolution. And distinguished delegates, this resolution is not about taking sides. It is about upholding international law and the principles of the UN Charter. The United Nations, distinguished delegates, is being tested today. It is important that all countries, especially the small states, send a clear signal that we are united for peace and we are united to defend the principles of the Charter and that we are united to uphold international law. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon. I would like to inform members that at 3 p.m. today, the General Assembly will first hold the 60th plenary meeting of the 76th regular session, as announced in the journal. This will be followed by the second plenary meeting of the 11th emergency special session, at which the debate on agenda item 5 will continue. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of agenda item 5. The meeting is adjourned.
who's a political scientist at Sciences Po here in Paris and author of the book, and the title in French is Poutine, la stratégie du désordre, which translates as Putin, the strategy of disorder. Thank you for being with us. Before we let loose the panel to discuss the issues relating to what's happening in Ukraine right now, let's take a look at this from our reporter who is there, Carl Cragg.
Ivan and Serhiy never thought the war could come right to their village. But on Sunday morning, Ukrainian air defences shot down an incoming rocket, scattering debris and damaging their houses.
So that's the situation. We'd been working for years on that house, my family and my wife's family. We were planning to move in this year. You could see it's now got no roof, no windows and no doors. We won't be able to move in so soon. That's part of the debris. The rocket was aimed at somewhere else, but landed here when our forces shot it.
The air defense system worked, and they shot it down. Good that it didn't reach its target. They're not aiming at poor villagers. They want to hit our defense forces.
Nearby, galvanized by these events, villagers have set up a checkpoint and are working on a dugout.
We're going to fight the Russians and defend ourselves any way possible. We'll fight them, of course. We're not going to let them stay and give them food.
Checkpoints like this are springing up all over the district, all over the country, in fact. The work of volunteers. Local kids are also involved.
There were more people here before, but they left because there wasn't much work.
Did you hear Putin say today he wants to prepare the nuclear weapons?
Don't worry, we'll shoot those missiles down with catapults.
Joking aside, this spirit of determination to do everything possible to fight off the Russians is to be found all over Ukraine.
Gallagher Cragg there, finding the indomitable spirits of some Ukrainian people in the face of the onslaught that is coming towards them. It has to be said, though, that the Russians perhaps not expecting the kind of resistance that they have met. Let's bring in first to comment on this Maria Zolkina, who's in Warsaw, from Kiev originally. Maria, you told me last time, political analyst at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thanks for being with us. I'm wondering what your thoughts are right now. We've had the talks on the Belarus border. We're hearing about, obviously, resistance building up within Ukraine against the Russians and people willing to basically give their lives to stop what's going on. What are your thoughts about the situation right now and where it goes?
Thank you. Yes, I am from Kyiv actually, but I was grown up in the very east of Ukraine, in Stanitsa Luganskaya. It was the checkpoint between occupied Donbas and government by Ukrainian side Donbas. So the my personal geography, let's say, of the conflict is really touching me, then touching my heart, because as of now, for instance, Stanitsa Luganskaya, my native actually town, was captured by occupational forces, but we hope it will be brought back by Ukrainian army in coming days. So when it comes to Kiev, really Russian army didn't expect, and Russian political establishment really didn't expect that kind of resistance, because in Kiev, this is around already almost 50,000 of people in so-called territorial defense forces, which are armed, which have needed equipment. The only thing they don't have is like some kind of tanks, machines, and that kind of artillery weapons. But they have automatic guns, and they have, most of them are reservists. It means that they have some kind of military experience in their past. So that is why in Kiev during last 2 days, the level of threat of Russian invasion exactly into Kyiv was very high, but they didn't succeed from any direction they tried to do it. And unfortunately for us, Kyiv is still a symbol for Russia. It is obvious that they are trying to encircle fully the city, to block it, and to blackmail then Ukrainians. As of now, in Kyiv, in evening, the missile strikes already started. The satellite town Brovary, which is like 10 kilometers from Kyiv border, I was actually living in that satellite town, so I know how it looks on the ground very well. This town was the object for airstrike attack like 30 minutes ago. At least six people are injured. So Russians are trying to capture the Kyiv from all the possible directions, but all their attempts so far were not successful. And from Belarus, they have trying to add new forces. This day, they added some new tanks columns right into Kyiv. They stopped a couple of dozens kilometers from Kyiv, and of course, they will try to attack. But according to Ukrainian officials, to the Ministry of Defense, this day, exactly this one and maybe the next one, they're actually decisive for the situation in case Russians will not succeed neither with Kyiv nor with Kharkiv, which are like two largest cities among all those around which the battles are going on. Then Russia will be actually in need to change their tactics dramatically. And here we have, on the one hand, more positive possible scenario when they will maybe try to negotiate somehow, but to a high extent, the worst possible scenario is possible because they are trying to hit residential areas, create chaos, kill as much people as they can with missile attacks, and destroy Ukrainian cities at all. And also the threat of using nuclear power either from Russian territory or by missile attack on Ukrainian nuclear power plants is also very high.
Let me just add to that, 352 people, civilians, that's the civilian death toll according to Ukraine's health ministry right now, which I think brings home just that people are dying in this conflict. It's not just about an army coming in and taking over some land, people are getting killed. Maria, thank you very much indeed. Belinda Herring there in Washington, listening to what Maria was saying there to kick off this discussion. What will Vladimir Putin be thinking right now, do you think?
That's a great question, and I think everyone wants to know that. So Vladimir Putin, the Vladimir Putin we've known and studied since the end of 1999, is not the same man today. He's acting in strange ways. He's taking greater risks than he's taken in the past. We've heard story after story of him in negotiations where he doesn't want to talk about the Minsk agreements or off-ramps, diplomatic off-ramps to the conflict. He wants to talk about Russia's historic grievances. He wants to talk about what NATO has done to him. So he's very angry, and he's behaving in a different way. He's, of course, threatened nuclear war, and no one knows, is he serious about it? It looks like from the pictures that his immediate team is very uncomfortable with this. But will they go along with it? I wish I could tell you something more. It's anyone's guess. Putin is isolated. He's been very, very isolated during COVID. And a lot of people think he may be sick or immunocompromised because he's requiring anyone who sees him to go into quarantine or to take 3 PCR tests, as he demanded of Emmanuel Macron. I think, though, I want to say something in response to what Maria said. She's right that the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian volunteers are heroic and brave, and they're doing an amazing job. But we need to be frank. There's a moment of optimism right now. Europe has unified behind Ukraine, and that's fabulous. We're seeing things happen that I really never expected, right? The Finns have just said that they're going to send weapons. Finland and Sweden are probably going to join NATO relatively soon. This is very, very good. But we need to be analytically honest. The Russians have held back so far, and they're not going to continue to hold back. This war is going to get much, much worse, and there's going to be massive civilian casualties. And there's probably going to be 5 to 7 million Ukrainian refugees pouring into the European Union if the situation continues at the pace that it's going at now.
Indeed, already 500,000 have made the crossing over. One woman I spoke to who was in the Kiev metro last Thursday, now safe in Romania, described getting through the borders as, well, difficult to say the very least. Melinda, for now, thank you very much indeed. Julien Theron, can I bring you in to talk about, with your knowledge of Putin, picking up from what Melinda was saying. His situation here, is he in a kind of an impasse where he can't go any further? Has he gone too far? Or does he have a completely different take on this whole thing? What's your kind of reaction? What's your thought?
When we conceptualized this strategy of disorder with Isabelle Mandreau, my co-author of the book, we understood that it was a broad strategy against the West because the Kremlin considered itself at war with the West. Something that is very hard for us to understand, first because it's not at all our war polity, and because we have no confliction whatsoever against Russia, right? But they do consider themselves at war. I'm not talking about the Russians, I'm talking about the Kremlin itself. And in this respect, we have to understand the psyche of the people in the Kremlin, especially talking about what we call the Siloviki, the persons who are responsible for the force, mainly intelligence services and the army. And in this respect, we were completely right to say that there is a discomfort about what is doing Vladimir Putin today, because yes, it does correspond to strategy of disorder. We can say so it's the continuation of what was happening in Georgia, in Syria. Syria, pretty much indeed, complete chaos over there, protecting a dictator able to gas his own people, use massive torture and so on. So yes, we could say that. But in the same time, I see at least 2 elements that are really questioning about, I wouldn't say is, psyche or something like that, because I'm not, a psychologist, so I don't want to express myself on that. But still, the first one is the fact that when it's self-justified with the war on Ukraine, he used such a speech and so outrageous reasons with the genocide, the Nazis, now the drug addicts. I mean, that nobody can, with quite reasonable expense of what is happening in Ukraine, can even believe in it, right? So that's a first. That's a first. The second element is he didn't even try to bring types of proofs or even the beginning of it, and that's quite new as well. I mean, he just went to war with 1 hour speech, outrageous speech, without any kind of proof, and that's new. That's brand new. We can say that this whole adventure, I was in Kiev last month actually, to understand precisely through my research how they conceptualize the whole resistance warfare, because they had this national resistance law at the beginning of January, and the colleagues were completely right. Now we have the territorial defense battalion, we have a bit of national guards, meaning like more or less a gendarmerie or something like that, plus the army and so on, and even a lot of initiatives from the civil society itself, from military side, but even conceptually warfare and so on. And it's like in Moscow they didn't see that, and it seems obvious. And this is why a lot of people actually mistaken themselves, because they thought that there would be no war. But it seemed obvious that it was going to be hell for Russian forces. But I definitely agree it will be much worse in the coming days. Syria has been created and protected to create a precedent for the whole century, to make us used to an extreme type of violence. Besiege cities with civilians inside, bombing hospitals, schools, markets is fine. Bombing the ICRC even is fine. Using gas is fine. So I definitely agree they are still holding themselves, and Vladimir Putin is saying usually things. He said that he will denazify the country, meaning that he wants to get rid of anything which is not aligned on Russia in the country. Second, he said, I will broaden the attack over there. He's saying what he's doing actually. And this means way worse. And if you understand the position he's in, like we said, the first cycle does not quite understand. He's a little bit like under attack even from the inside, the population, and potentially even the oligarchs and the Siloviki. So it's just like on a row, is just like going to go further, I think.
Julian, thank you very much indeed. Ulrich Köhn, I know you're listening and clearly have things that you want to say too, from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy there at the University of Hamburg. Parallels are being drawn, and perhaps they're it's a bit of a reach, but parallels are being drawn between what Putin's doing and what Adolf Hitler tried to do in terms of taking back land, in terms of using excuses to move into countries, those kind of things. Now, perhaps it's a bit of a reach, but what is your sense about the possibility of stopping this? I mean, do you hear anything that's given you a sense that this can be stopped?
Well, first of all, I do get drawing these parallels because what we see Mr. Putin is doing here really recalls the darkest periods of the 20th century. His talking about race, his talking about not accepting that there is a Ukrainian statehood, that there is a Ukrainian folk, the whole idea about conquering land in land warfare, that very much recalls what we heard or what we've seen in history from the Nazis. So I do get these parallels. The question, how do we get out of this whole quagmire? This is really something that concerns me since the last, let's say, 48 hours, particularly now that we see that the Russian campaign is not going as Putin expected it to be. And honestly, this is very much because of the brave fight of the Ukrainians. But I think it's also because what we see is, don't get me wrong, probably not a very professional campaign on the side of the Russians. So the point that I want to make here is what would be a good outcome here? I mean, I think most analysts expected that the Russians would be able to invade Ukraine within a couple of days or weeks. And of course, we've seen from history that those kind of aggressive leaders, the appetite comes with the eating. So if Putin is still able to achieve an early victory here, then the question would be, would he stop here, or would the next be perhaps Moldova, or perhaps even the Baltic states that are protected by Article 5 NATO commitments. The other side is, if Putin is not able to make a quick win, if this becomes a protracted conflict that goes on and costs more and more Russian soldiers' lives, will he have to back down? I don't see Putin backing down. I think then the risk really increases, and we heard that at the beginning, that perhaps Putin might ponder even employing nuclear weapons. So the question here is really, what are the potential off-ramps? And I know it might sound at this point not really morally right to think about off-ramps for a war criminal, but I think if we want to make sure that this whole thing does not become bigger than it already is right now, we really in the West need to think, what are those potential off-ramps?
Indeed, and that tag of war criminal indeed is something that has been very much associated with Vladimir Putin because of this whole campaign that he's put into Ukraine. I'm wondering, you raised the issue there about nuclear attack, Ulrich. Surely that would be madness, would it not? Because there's no such thing as a safe, contained, well-tailored nuclear attack, is there?
Well, let's just recall what the Russians put out a couple of weeks ago together with the United States, with France, with the UK, and with China. They basically echoed a statement from Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev from 1987, that is, a nuclear war cannot be won, so it should never be fought. That's something that they put in writing at the beginning of this year. So I would like to remind the Russian president that his country signed up to that. And I think that's exactly what Western leaders need to do right now. Remind the Russians that they do have a global responsibility here. And in that regard, I have to say that the reactions by Stratcom, by the US leaders, also in France, in the UK, that was exactly how you respond to these kind of threats. They basically said, look, don't do it. There's no reason to do it. We will not mirror what you're doing. Just stay calm. We know you're nuclear armed. You know we're nuclear armed. So let's just not get into that.
The nuclear deterrent is the phrase that comes back to me from my history teacher when I was a lad. Ulrich, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a look then at the nuclear arsenal, what could be at the disposal of Vladimir Putin should he choose. And he's hinted that he will, and we're hearing today that all aspects of Russia's nuclear arsenal is on standby. Emerald Maxwell with this.
Vladimir Putin raised the stakes when he ordered Russia's deterrence forces, which wield nuclear weapons, onto high alert. An alarming move, given that Moscow has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, last year Russia had over 6,000 warheads, slightly more than its American rival. Of these, Russia has more than 1,600 warheads deployed, meaning they're on missiles or bomber bases ready to be fired at relatively short notice. Between them, Russia and the US possess approximately 90% of the world's stockpile. In among the Russian arsenal is a weapon known by its NATO codename Satan II. The RS-28 Sarmat is the largest intercontinental ballistic missile ever made. Russian authorities claim its range exceeds 10,000 kilometers, and it's capable of carrying between 10 and 15 nuclear warheads, meaning it could destroy a territory the size of France. The West fears that a constitutional shift from Russia's ally Belarus to allow nuclear missiles on its soil could now bring Moscow's devastating weapons closer to their borders.
We know what does it mean for Belarus to be nuclear. It means that Russia will put nuclear weapons in Belarus. And this is a very dangerous path.
Like other nuclear weapon states, Moscow has used its capability primarily as a deterrent. And this isn't the first time Putin has made such threats. Russian nuclear forces were also put on high alert during the 2014 annexation of Crimea to put off any retaliation.
It is very sobering watching that report. Julien, your quick reaction?
Yes, I think we did a mistake before this third invasion of Ukraine, because let's remember that it was the third one. A mistake of perception that we didn't see it coming in Western Europe, because we didn't want to listen to the Baltic states. We spoke about American alarmism and these sort of things. now, like our guest said it, we are in a moment of triumphalism because Europe united, changed its path, Germany invested a massive amount of money, we transfer weapons, even planes, that's brand new, we are uniting Europe and NATO. That would be a mistake to think that now we are in a phase of triumphalism. We should not, because the crisis is continuing, it might be continuing, like we said earlier, in terms of conventional warfare, getting worse against the civilians as well. But it might be nuclear as well. Let me say just a couple of things. When we think, like you said, Mark, when we think about nuclear, we think about Saturn II, big missiles, you know, strategic bombers, strategic submarines and so on. It's not only that. It might be the case, and we shall not think that this would never happen. But there's also other things as nuclear. Actually, nuclear went tactical these last decades. We have lower enriched ammunition, and we have also what we call mini nukes, for instance, against bunkers, against facilities buried into a mountain. And we can use like operational nuclear against, for instance, a communication center or a heavily guarded base or something like that. So, I mean, we have several layers. And I worked a bit on this possibility to actually that we are wrong about nuclear being just about deterrence, you don't touch me, you don't touch, you know, it's this mutual assured destruction doctrine. But we are way past that. And actually nuclear can be, you know, in practice on the theatre of war, actually.
Indeed. I wonder what our viewers in Ukraine might be feeling right now, hearing this very chilling explanation about what could happen. Let's go back to Warsaw. Poland, where Maria Zolkina is awaiting us, political analyst at Iko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation, originally from Kiev, originally from Donbass, brought up in Kiev, now living in Warsaw. Maria, I'm asking you to speak for the whole country of Ukraine. How do you think people are feeling right now, hearing this?
People are really scared with the probability of usage of nuclear weapon by Russia. The fact is that after invasion of Russia and after these absolutely cruel airstrikes and missile attacks on people, on ordinary people, on civilians, the general perception of the situation among locals is that Putin is a mad guy. And as far as we see, up to this moment, he is of course not ready to give up with his invasion into Ukraine, and it seems that he can be, let's say, cornered to some extent. If he is not succeeding with his original plan of Blitzkrieg, he is not. We understand that he is not succeeding. He hasn't succeeded with that. Up to this moment. So he has to increase the level of casualties against civilians. He has to destroy our cities. And another idea is to create ecological catastrophe, or to use cruel instruments in terms of using nuclear weapons. I will remind to our audience that yesterday Russia has already organized missile attack on the settlement near Kyiv, where the radioactive waste disposal site is. And it was just fortune that missiles just landed very close to the to this site, to this disposal, but not inside the storage actually of radioactive elements themselves. So people really are scared with the possibility of using this kind of mad instrument against Ukraine, and that is why these days the most let's say popular demand towards our partners on the side of Ukrainian people is to make at least to try to make the sky safe. Of course, it will not help in case Russia will use nuclear weapons against Ukraine and the whole Europe, but at least it will help to prevent all those cruel airstrikes and missile attacks against civilians in residential areas. And that is why so people are talking mainly only about it, not about other sanctions, but about the idea to create urgently safe zone, non-fly zone above Ukraine. And this is not a military mean like Western countries as of now think, and as they explain to us that this is the argument, it will be military confrontation between NATO and Russia, and everyone in NATO still wants to prevent this kind of confrontation. But it is also can be considered as a humanitarian mean, as a humanitarian idea to prevent these cruel developments in Ukraine.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. Just reminding people, Ukraine's health ministry says 352 people, civilians, have been killed. Among those, sadly, 14 children. As Maria was speaking to us, we saw images that our team in Ukraine has filmed of basically women, children, you've got babes in arms, sheltering from what might happen. We're hearing here on set that there could be a kind of low-grade nuclear usage of weaponry which could target any kind of place that the Russians want to strike. The resistance continues with the civilians standing up in Ukraine and slowing down that Russian advance. Melinda Herring from the Atlantic Council, I'd like to bring you back in. Eurasia specialist, of course, as I think is apparent from everything you say. Vladimir Putin, madman or Machiavel? What do you think? Is it a mix of both, perhaps?
I think both, Mark. Do you mind if I pull us back from the nuclear
Please,
abyss for
go
just
ahead,
a minute
go ahead.
and offer a tiny bit of hope?
Please, go on.
Okay, great. I thought this... Okay, I'm usually the skunk at the garden party, but I can't do that today. You guys have outpaced me. So I want to make an argument. I'm a think tank expert. I'm not an Old Testament prophet, so I'm not going to give you a date. But I think it's pretty clear that Putin is done, and he's severely miscalculated. So Vladimir Putin thinks he understands Ukraine better than he actually does. He thought that he could go into Ukraine and it would be only a matter of days and hours for Kiev and the country to roll over. And he's finding a fierce resistance, as Maria has said. Not only is the Ukrainian army much stronger than he expected, we've seen thousands of ordinary peoples, lawyers, accountants, doctors, who are now running around the country with AK-47s. Do they have the same kind of training as Russian military? No, they don't. You know, some of them do have a military background. Is it enough? No. Russia has a much better Air Force and a much better Navy. But with, you know, they're much more determined than the Russian forces are. They know that this struggle is existential. They've been fighting this war for 8 years, and it's also their home turf. So they do have a number of advantages. But I think we also have to look at what's going on in Russia itself. So in the last week, there were protests across Russia. Are they massive and going to shake Putin to the ground now? No. But there were protests in 53 different cities. We're seeing Russian oligarchs coming out and condemning Vladimir Putin. We know that more and more people don't want to support the war effort. And Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, gave an incredibly powerful address. He spoke in Russian to the Russian people, and he said, Ukraine is not what you think it is. We don't want war. We want peace. And he called on all Russian citizens to resist. I had chills up my spine. I think it was very, very powerful. So, look, I can't tell you when it's going to happen, but Putin's legitimacy is eroding before our eyes.
Indeed, those protests that we've seen, Melinda, in Moscow around Russia against this, I'll say unprecedented. It's an overused word these days, but it is something you don't see very often in Russia, that kind of open dissent in the streets.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's important to remind your viewers, too, that Russia has changed a lot since 2014. So in 2014, Putin came into Ukraine and he annexed the Crimea Peninsula. It was illegal. And then he tried to take part of the Donbass. And he's been occupying about 7% of the Donbass for 8 years. When that happened in 2014, there were massive protests in Moscow. The Russians didn't like it, but Russia has changed a lot since 2014. It's become increasingly repressive. Almost all the opposition has moved abroad. Independent media has been suppressed. Civil society has been suppressed. So it's really hard to get people to come out on the streets because they're afraid of being put in jail and they're afraid for their physical security. So the fact that we're seeing protests across Russia is extraordinary.
Indeed, Russian propaganda units RT, Sputnik being banned in the EU. Similar bans in the UK. Russia's likely to ban the BBC. France 24, we understand, still available everywhere. So we'll continue to give the truth and tell the story straight down the middle with no bias. But, you know, we can only reflect on what we see, what we hear, what we know, and what our correspondents find. And this is what we're trying to do here and bring in some expert analysis too. Ulrich in Hamburg from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. Ulrich Kuhn. Germany's position's changed, that of Finland to that of Sweden. Putin perhaps succeeding in uniting his enemies all against him?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the inadvertent outcomes, I would say, at least from the perspective of Mr. Putin. I think no one was expecting the European Union to rally around the flag that fast. I think no one was expecting that Germany would really see that as a watershed moment, that Germany would actually give up on its policy of economics first, but now actually turns to a security first policy. And particularly when we also look at the other states that are not a part of either NATO or the European Union, even skeptical countries like Switzerland and Austria are coming on board. So I think that's he has succeeded to build a front. The question is, what do we do with that now? And the question is, what happens in Russia? I have to say, I'm not as optimistic as Melinda is as regards the Russians rising up against Mr. Putin. I hope they would, but from what I hear from Moscow, this seems not to be really the case. And I mean, I personally could imagine at some point that we might see a palace coup where some of Putin's inner clique, particularly perhaps from the armed forces, actually decide that it's enough with that leader. But let's be careful what we're wishing for, because this is Russia. We have no idea what comes after Putin. We think that's the worst outcome. Well, let's not be naive. We don't know whether the next leader in Russia will be the democratic president of our liking.
Indeed. Look, thank you very much indeed. It was Julian earlier who mentioned Georgia 2008, of course, when Putin found an excuse to go in and support two Georgian enclaves who'd apparently asked for his support. Let's hear now from the president of Georgia, who's in Paris. She was speaking earlier.
I think that he is becoming aware that he has given birth to a monster. He has created a Europe more powerful than has ever existed before. Everything he feared, that is to say, to have states that are unified and strong militarily at his border, he is going to get that.
Salamir Zurabashvili there, the president of Georgia. Julian Theron, this is possibly the final comment, but we'll try to get everybody in if I possibly can. Has a monster been created? Can the monster be stopped? What happens next?
I think that the war in Ukraine cannot be won by the Russians. We have no, in war studies, we have no example of a conventional army staying on the long run on a territory, especially on a territory on 44 million inhabitants, where, yes, a lot of them left, but not that much regarding 44 million, right? They cannot. They just cannot. And indeed, I think that Vladimir Putin is reading not that well Ukraine, and I think he might be reading not that well Russia neither. It's a war also inside Russia, although it's not a conventional military over there. It's political, but it matters a lot indeed. So the problem there, and I do agree with Ulrich that he has to find a way out. If he doesn't find a way out, he will go further and further and further until, you know, keeping the power, whatever danger he creates for us, all the Europeans and the Russians as well. So we are in a strategic situation which is really tensed, and obviously the main power rests actually in the hands of the Russians themselves. But yes, Melinda said it, yeah, well, actually they live in a very repressed society more than in 2014 indeed, so it's quite difficult to say if they managed to, you know, create a new democratic society in Russia, right? Or if perhaps, because that's a possibility, that a new leader in Russia, post-Vladimir Putin, hyper-centralized power might be actually even worse.
My producer Alessandro has stolen more time for us so I can get everybody in before we end the show. Let's go to Maria back in Warsaw. Maria, the what happens next question is what I'm putting to you. And we heard, obviously, that we don't know quite what follows Vladimir Putin. Ulrich was talking about that, I think. From your perspective, from where you're looking at this thing in Warsaw, what is the worst case scenario? If he is taken away, if he is pushed aside, what do you think will happen next?
The worst possible scenario is that he really attacks some critical some critical enterprises, including nuclear power plant. I remind that in Zaporizhia, which is very close to the active battlefield, and Zaporizhia itself was already hit by missiles, but not as heavily as other cities of Ukraine. In Zaporizhia, the biggest nuclear power station in Europe is situated. Besides of that, Russians have occupied and controlled the Chernobyl zone, and according to radiologists, the level of radiation is already increasing right there. So as of now, this is the worst possible scenario, which will be supported by the hostilities and casualties against ordinary people in residential areas all over Ukraine. That's why Ukraine needs as much weapons as it possible, including air defense system. The maximum which Ukraine, full isolation of Russia in terms of financial connections and all other means of isolation, and Ukraine's maximum goal for these coming days is to stand firm, to keep all the cities controlled by Ukrainian government, and to continue to demand NATO countries to support Ukraine either with the most serious possible air defense system or maximum with non-fly zone above Ukraine.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. Ulrich, can I bring you back in? Ulrich from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. That idea of more arms, is that the solution? Obviously, the EU's decided on this unprecedented, and there's that word again, 450 million euro military aid, which is going to be given to help Ukraine. Is that the right thing?
Well, I think in the end, for the next couple of days and weeks, the West needs to walk an extremely fine line between supporting the Ukrainian army, also with weapons, and at the same time making sure that the West does not end up in an inadvertent escalation scenario with Russia, between Russia and NATO. In that regard, I'm against the establishment of a no-fly zone because technically it would mean to take out Russian forces via NATO forces, and I think that's exactly the kind of scenario that we need to avoid in the end.
Ulrich, thank you very much indeed. Final comment will go to Melinda Haring, Eurasia Specialist at the Atlantic Council. And I'm wondering, Melinda, and obviously take this wherever you want and say whatever you wish, but what does Joe Biden do when he hears all these things about the nuclear threat?
I think Joe Biden knows that we can't blink right now, and Zelensky knows that we can't blink right now. One thing that we haven't talked about during this debate is the massive change in President Zelensky. I'm one of his biggest critics. There's a lot of critics.
Damn people!
He was not a good president for the first 2 years. He backtracked on almost all of the important anti-corruption and judicial reform, but he's become a world-class leader in the last 5 days. He's shown a stiff upper lip. He's inspired the world. When reports came out that the U.S. had offered him a lift out of Kiev, he said, "I don't need a lift, I need ammo." He is walking around. He's not hiding in a bunker. He's communicating with people. And I think that we have seen the birth of a great leader who is inspiring the West and reminding us why the West was great.
I tried to get a video up as the buffer. I was going to play a video, which I might play anyhow. You may notice I'm not in my basement studio. I'm not saying that I'm in the bathroom again for another vlog, live stream. I'm just saying if I have to go to the bathroom, it might be a very short walk. We are not in our studio because it's spring break with the kids, and we're in the middle of the woods in Quebec, and it's beautiful. I'm just hoping the internet holds up, but audio quality, video quality, I'm off my computer, mic, and camera. And it sucks. But it is content over form. And that's what's most important. It is the information, not the means of communication of the information. Bad internet is better than no internet. And what a week. What a week it's been. We're going to see, it's going to be a spicy chat because we've gone from the, what would be called the absolute absurdity of Canada over the last month, which you could only have had a diverging opinion on, the outrageousness of that behavior of what happened in Canada over the last month, if you only watch Canadian legacy media. Anybody with half an open mind, anybody with half an ounce of knowledge of what actually happened in Canada over the last month, from those protests to them being broken up after an abusive declaration of the Emergencies Act, police coming in, literally beating up protesters, pepper spraying protesters, assaulting reporters. The only people who could not be thoroughly convinced as to how wrong that was watch CBC, CTV Global News. So there was sort of unanimity among observers who were reasonably informed about what was going on as to how bad it was. Now we've entered another crisis, which is the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That is very polarizing. It's very polarizing, and it's very interesting because